Chapter 4. Martha. When she opened her eyes in the morning, it was because a young housemaid had come into her room to light the fire, and was kneeling on the hard rock raking out of the cinders noisily. Mary lay and watched her for a few moments, and then began to look about the room. She had never seen a room at all like it, and thought it curious and gloomy. The walls were covered with tapestry, with a forest scene embroidered on it. There were fantastically dressed people under the trees, and in the distance there was a glimpse of the turrets of a castle. There were hunters and horses and dogs and ladies. Mary felt as if she were in the forest with them. Out of a deep window she could see a great clumping stretch of land which seemed to have no trees on it, and to look rather like an endless, dull, purplish sea. "What is that?" she asked. She said, pointing out of the window. Martha, the young housemaid who had just risen to her feet, looked and pointed also. "That there," she said. "Yes, that's the moor," with a good-natured grin. "Does thou like it?" "No," answered Mary. "I hate it." "That's because thou's not used to it," Martha said, going back to her heart. "Thou think it's too big but bar now, but thou would like it." "Do you?" inquired Mary. "Aye, that I do," answered Martha, chiefly polishing away at the grate. "I just love it. It's not bare. It's covered with growing things that smell sweet. It's fair lovely in spring and summer, and when they grow, and bloom, and heathers in flower, it smells of honey, and there's such a lot of fresh air, and the sky looks so high, and the bees and the skylarks make such a nice noise humming and singing. I wouldn't leave away from the moor for anything." Mary listened to her with a grave, puzzled expression. The native servants she had been used to in India were not in the least like this. They were obsequious and servile, and did not presume to talk to their masters as if they were their equals. They made salams, and called them protector of the poor, and names of that sort. Indian servants were commanded to do things, not acts. It was not the custom to say please or thank you, and Mary had always slapped her Ayah in the face when she was angry. She wondered a little what this girl would do if one slapped her in the face. She was a round, rosy, good-natured looking creature, but she had a sturdy way which made Mistress Mary wonder if she might not even slap again, if the person who slapped her was only a little girl. "You are a strange servant," she said from her pews rather haughtily. Martha sat up on her heels with her blackened brush in her hand and laughed without seeming the least out of temper. "I know it," she said. "If there was a grand misuse as Misselthwaite, I should never have been even one of the under housemaids. I might have been let to be scullery maid, but I'd never have been let upstairs. I'm too common, and I talk too much Yorkshire. But this is a funny house, for all it's so grand. Seems like there neither master nor mistress except Mr. Pitch and Mrs. Medlock. Mr. Craven, he won't be troubled about anything when he's here, and he's nearly always away. Mrs. Medlock gave me the place out of kindness. She told me she could never have done it if Misselthwaite had been like other big houses." "Are you going to be my servant?" Mary asked, still in her imperious little Indian way. Martha began to rub her grate again. "I am Mrs. Medlock's servant," she said stoutly, "and she's Mr. Craven's, but I'm to do the housemaid's work up here, and waiting on you a bit, but you won't need much waiting on." "Who's going to dress me?" demanded Mary. Martha sat up on her heels again and stared. She spoke in broad Yorkshire in her amazement. "Can I dress myself?" she said. "What do you mean? I don't understand your language," said Mary. "Oh, I forgot," Martha said. "Mrs. Medlock told me I had to be careful or we didn't know what I was saying. I mean, can't you put on your own clothes?" "No," answered Mary quite indignantly. "I never did it in my life. My Ayah dressed me, of course." "Well," said Martha, evidently not in the least aware that she was impudent, "it's time thou should learn. Thou cannot begin younger." It would do thee good to wait on thy side a bit, and my mother always said she couldn't see why grand people's children didn't turn out fair fools, what with nurses and being washed and dressed and took out to walks, as if they was pure puppies. It is different in India, said Mistress Mary disdainfully. She could scarcely stand this, but Martha was not at all crushed. Yeah, I can't see it's different, she answered almost emphatically. I dare say it's because there's such a lot of blacks there instead of respectable white people. When I heard you was coming from India, I thought you was black too. Mary sat up in bed furious. What? She said. What? You thought I was native? You daughter of a pig. Martha stared and looked hard. You call her names, she said. You needn't to be so vexed. That's not the way for a young lady to talk. I've nothing against the blacks. When you read about them in tracts, they always very religious. You always read as a black man or brother. You've never seen a black, and I was fair pleased to think I was going to see one close. When I come in to light your fire this morning, I crept out to your bed and pulled the cover back, careful to look at you, and there you was, disappointedly. No more black than me, for all you're so yellow. Mary did not even try to control her rage and humiliation. You thought I was a native. You dared. You don't know anything about natives. They're not people. They're servants who must salam to you. You know nothing about India. You know nothing about anything. She was in such a rage and felt so helpless before the girl's simple stare, and somehow she suddenly felt so horribly lonely and far away from everything she understood, and which understood her, that she threw herself face downward on the pillows and burst into passionate sobbing. She sobbed so unrestrainedly that good-natured Yorkshire Martha was a little frightened and quite sorry for her. She went to the bed and bent over her. You mustn't cry like that there, she begged. You mustn't for sure. I didn't know you'd be vexed. I don't know anything about anything, like just you said. I beg your pardon, miss. Do stop crying. There was something comforting and really friendly in her queer Yorkshire speech and sturdy way which had a good effect on Mary. She gradually ceased crying and became quiet. Martha looked relieved. It's time for thee to get up now, she said. Mrs. Medlock said I was to carry the breakfast and tea and dinner into the room next to this. It's been made in a nursery for thee. I'll have thee on thy clothes and that get out of bed. And the buttons, and at the back the cannot button them up themselves. The Mary at least decided to get up. The clothes Martha took from the wardrobe were not the ones she had worn when she arrived the night before with Mrs. Medlock. This is not mine, she said. Mine are black. She looked at the thick white wool coat and dress over and added with calm approval. These are nicer than mine. These are the ones thou must put on, Martha answered. Mr. Craven orders Mr. Medlock to get them in London. He said I won't have a child dressed in black wandering about like a lost soul, he said. It's made the place sadder than it is. Put colour on her. Mother, she said she knew what he meant. Mother always knows what a bad means. She doesn't hold with black hairs. I hate black things, said Mary. The dressing process was one which taught them about something. Martha had buttoned up her little sisters and brothers, but she had never seen a child who stood still and waited for another person to do things for her, as if she had neither hands nor feet of her own. Why doesn't thou put on thy own shoes? She said when Mary quite held out her feet. My eye did it, answered Mary, staring. It was the custom. She said that very often. It was the custom. The native servants were always saying it. If one told them to do a thing their ancestors had not done for 1,000 years, they gazed at one mildly and said, It's not the custom, and one knew that was the end of the matter. It had not been the custom that Mistress Mary should do anything but stand and allow herself to be dressed like a doll, but before she was ready for breakfast she began to suspect that her life in Misselthwaite Manor would end by teaching her a number of things quite new to her. Things such as putting on her own shoes and stockings and picking up things she let fall. If Martha had been well trained for a young lady's maid, she would have been more subservient and respectful, and would have known that it was her business to brush her hair and button boots, and pick things up and lay them away. She was, however, only an untrained Yorkshire rustic who had been brought up in a moorland cottage with a swarm of little brothers and sisters who had never dreamed of doing anything but waiting on themselves, and on the younger ones who were either babies in arms or just learned to totter about and tumble over things. If Mary Lennox had been a child who was ready to be amused, she would perhaps have laughed at Martha's readiness to talk, but Mary only listened at her coldly and wondered at her freedom of manner. At first she was not at all interested, but gradually, as the girl rattled on in her good-tempered, homely way, Mary began to notice what she was saying. "Hi, you should see them all," she said. "There's 12 of us, and my father only gets 16 shillings a week. I can tell you my mother's put it out to get porridge for all them. They tumble about on the moor and play there all day, and mother says the air of the moor fatten them. She says she believes they eat the grass, same as the wild ponies do. Our Dickon, he's 12 years old, and he gets young pony he calls his own." "Where did he get it?" asked Mary. "He found it on the moor with its mother when it was a little one, and he began to make friends with it and give it a bit of bread and pluck young grass for it, and it got to like him as it follows him about it lets him to get on its back. Dickon a kind lad, and animals likes him." Mary had never possessed an animal pet of her own, and had always thought she would like one. So she began to feel a slight interest in Dickon, and as she had never before been interested in anyone but herself, it was a dawning of a healthy sentiment. When she went into the room which had been made in a nursery for her, she found that it was rather like the one she had slept in. It was not a child's room, but a grown-up person's room, with gloomy old pictures on the walls and heavy old oak chairs. A table in the centre was set with a good substantial breakfast, but she had always had a very small appetite, and she looked with something more than indifference at the first place Martha set before her. "I don't want it," she said. "Thou doesn't like thy porridge," Martha explained incredulously. "No." "Thou doesn't know how good it is. Put a bit of treat on it and a bit of sugar." "I don't want it," repeated Mary. "Aye," said Martha. "I can abide to see good victuals go to waste. If our children was at this table, they'd clean it bare in 5 minutes." "Why?" said Mary coldly. "Why?" echoed Martha. "These scars have had their stomachs full in their lives. They're as hungry as the hogs and fox." "I don't know what it is to be hungry," said Mary with the indifference of ignorance. Martha looked indignant. "Well, it would do thee good to try it. I can see that plain enough," she said outspokenly. "I've no patience with folks as sees and just stares at good and bread and meat. My word, and I wish Dickon and Phil and Jane and the rest of them had what he and they pinafores." "Why don't you take it to them?" suggested Mary. "It's not mine," answered Martha stoutly, "and this isn't my day out. I get my day out once a month, same for the rest. Then I go home and clean up for my mother and give her a day's rest." Mary drank some tea and ate a little toast and some marmalade. "You wrap up warm and run out and play with you," said Martha. "It will do you good and give you some stomach for your meat." Mary went to the window. There were gardens and paths and big trees, but everything looked dull and wintry. "Out? Why should I go out on a day like this?" "Well, if thou doesn't go out, thou have to stay in, and what hast thou got to do?" Mary glanced about her. There was nothing to do. When Mrs. Medlock had prepared the nursery, she had not thought of amusement. Perhaps it would be better to go and see what the gardens were like. "Who will go with me?" she inquired. Martha said. "You go by yourself," she answered. "You have to learn to play like other children does when they haven't got sisters and brothers. Our Dickon goes over on the moor by himself and plays for hours. That's how he made friends with the pony. He's got sheep on the moor that knows him, and birds that comes and eats out of his hand. However little there's to it, he always saves a bit of his bread to coax his pets." It was really this mention of Dickon which made Mary decide to go out, though she was not aware of it. There would be birds outside, though there would not be ponies or sheep. They would be different from the birds in India, and it might amuse her to look at them. Myrtle found her coat and hat for her and a pair of stout little boots, and she showed her way downstairs. "If that goes round that way, there come the gardens," she said, pointing to a gate in a wall of shrubbery. "There's lots of flowers in the summer time, but there's nothing blooming now." She seemed to hesitate a second before she added, "One of the gardens is locked up. No one has been in it for 10 years. "Why?" asked Mary, in spite of herself. Here was another locked door added to the 100 in the strange house. "Mr. Craven had it shut when his wife died 2000. He won't let no one go aside. It was her garden. He locked her the moor and dug a hole and buried the key. There's Mrs. Medlock's bell ringing. I must run." After she was gone, Mary turned down the walk which led to the door in the shrubbery. She could not help thinking about the garden which no one had been into for 10 years. She wondered what it would look like and whether there were any flowers still alive in it. When she had passed through the shrubbery gate, she found herself in great gardens with wide lawns and winding walks with clipped borders. There were trees and flower beds, and evergreen clipped into strange shapes, and a large pool with an old grey fountain in its midst. But the flower beds were bare and wintry, and the fountain was not playing. This was not the garden which was shut up. How could the garden be shut up? You could always walk into a garden. She was just thinking this when she saw that at the end of the path she was following there seemed to be a long wall with ivy growing over it. She was not familiar enough with England to know that she was coming upon the kitchen gardens where the vegetables and fruit were growing. She went toward the wall and found that there was a green door in the ivy, and that it stood open. This was not the closer garden, evidently, and she could go into it. She went through the door and found that it was a garden with walls all around it, and that it was only one of several walled gardens which seemed to open into one another. She saw another open green garden of revealing bushes and pathways between beds containing winter vegetables. Fruit trees were trained flat against the wall, and over some of the beds were the glass frames. The place was bare and ugly enough, Mary thought, as she stood and stared about her. It might be nicer in summer when things were green, but there was nothing pretty about it now. Presently, an old man with a spade over his shoulder walked through the door, loading from the second garden. He looked startled when he saw Mary, and then touched his cap. He had a surly old face, and did not seem at all pleased to see her. But then she was displeased with his garden, and wore her quite contrary expression, and certainly did not seem at all pleased to see him. "What is this place?" she asked. "One of the kitchen gardens," he answered. "What is that?" said Mary, pointing through the other green door. "Another of them," shortly. "There's another on the other side on the wall, and there's some orchard and the ivy of that." "Can I go in them?" asked Mary. "If thou likes. But there's naught to see." Mary made no response. She went down the path and through the second green door. There she found more walls and winter vegetables and glass frames, but in the second wall there was another green door, and it was not open. Perhaps it led into the garden which no one had seen for 10 years. As she was not at all a timid child and always did what she wanted to do, Mary went to the green door and turned the handle. She hoped the door would not open because she wanted to be sure that she had found the mysterious garden, but it did open quite easily, and she walked through it and found herself in an orchard. There were walls all around it also, and trees trained against them, and there were bare fruit trees growing in the winter brown grass, but there was no green door to be seen anywhere. Mary looked for it, and yet when she had entered the upper end of the garden she had noticed that the wall did not seem to end with the orchard, but to extend beyond it, as if it enclosed a place at the other side. She could see the tops of trees above the wall, and when she stood still she saw a bird with a bright red breast sitting on the topmost branch of one of them, and suddenly he burst into his winter song, almost as if he had caught sight of her and was calling to her. She stopped and listened to him, and somehow his cheerful, friendly little whistle gave her a pleased feeling. Even a disabled little girl may be lonely, and the big closed house and a big bare moor and a big bare gardens had made this one feel as if there was no one left in the world but herself. If she had been an affectionate child who had been used to being loved, she would have broken her heart, but even though she was Mistress Mary quite contrary, she was desolate, and the bright-breasted little bird brought a look into her little face, which was almost a smile. She listened to him until he flew away. He was not like an Indian bird, and she liked him, and wondered if she should ever see him again. Perhaps he lived in the mysterious garden and knew all about it. Perhaps it was because she had nothing whatever to do that she thought so much of the deserted garden. She was curious about it, and wanted to see what it was like. Why had Mr. Archibald Craven buried the key? If he had liked his wife so much, why did he hate her garden? She wondered if she should ever see him, but she knew that if she did, she should not like him, and he would not like her, and that she should only stand and stare at him and say nothing, though she should be wanting dreadfully to ask him why he had done such a queer thing. People never like me, and I never like people, she thought, and I never can talk as the Crawford children could. They were always talking and laughing and making noises. She thought of the robin and of the way he seemed to sing his song at her, and as she remembered the tree top he perched on, she stopped rather suddenly on the path. "I believe that the tree was in the secret garden. I feel sure it was," she said. "There was a wall around the place. There was no door." She walked back into the kitchen garden. She had entered and found the old man digging there. She went and stood beside him and watched him a few moments in her cold little way. He took no notice of her, so at last she spoke to him. "I had been into the other gardens," she said. "There was nothing to prevent thee," he answered crossly. "I went into the orchard." "There was no dog in the door to bite thee," he answered. "There was no door there into the other garden," said Mary. "What garden?" he said in a rough voice, stopping his digging for a moment. "The one on the other side of the wall," answered Mistress Mary. "There are trees there. I saw the tops of them. The bird with a red breast was sitting on one of them, and he sang." To her surprise, the surly old weather-beaten face actually changed its expression. A slow smile spread over it, and the gardener looked quite different. It made her think that it was curious how much nicer people looked when he smiled. She had not thought of it before. He turned about to the orchard side of his garden and began to whistle, a low, soft whistle. She could not understand how such a surly man could make such a coaxing sound. Almost the next moment a wonderful thing happened. She heard a soft little rushing flies through the air, and it was the birds with the red breast flying to them. He actually alighted on a big cloud of earth quite near to the garden's foot. "He hears," chuckled the old man, and then he spoke to the bird as if he were speaking to a child. "Where hast thou been, the cheeky little beggar?" he said. "I have not seen thee before to-day. Hast thou begun thy courting this early in the season? Thou'st too for it." The bird put his tiny head on one side and looked up at him with his soft, bright eyes, which was like a black dewdrop. He seemed quite familiar and not the least afraid. He hopped about and pecked the earth briskly, looking for seeds and insects. It actually gave Mary a queer feeling in her heart, because he was so pretty and cheerful and seemed so like a person. He had a tiny plump body and a delicate beak and slender delicate legs. "Will he always come when you call him?" she asked almost in a whisper. "Aye, that he will. I've known him ever since he was a ploughing. He come out of the rest on the other garden, and when Thursdays flew over the wall. He was too weak to fly back for a few days, and we got friendly. When he went over the wall again, the rest of the world was gone, and he was lonely, and he come back to me." "What kind of bird is he?" Mary asked. "Doesn't thou know? He's a robin redbreast, and there's the friendliest, curious birds alive. They're almost as friendly as dogs, if you know how to get on with them. Watch him pecking about or looking around at us now and again. Who knows we're talking about him?" It was the queerest thing in the world to see the old fellow. He looked at the plump little scarlet waistcoated bird as if he were both proud and fond of him. He's a conceited one, he chuckled. He likes to hear folk talk about him, and courage, bless me, never was like him for curiosity and meddling. He's always coming to see what I'm planting. He knows all the things Mr. Craven never troubles himself to find out. He's a bad gardener, he is. The robin hopped about busily, pecking the soil, and now and then stopped to look at them a little. Mary thought his black dewdrop-eyed gazed at her with great curiosity. It really seemed as if he were finding out all about her. The queer feeling in her heart increased. "Where did the rest of the bird fly to?" she asked. "There's no knowing. The old ones turn them out of the nest to make them fly, and they've clattered before you know it. This one was a knowing one. He knew he was alone." Mistress Mary went a step near to the robin and looked at him very hard. "I am lonely," she said. She had not known before that this was one of the things which made her feel sore and cross. She seemed to find it out when the robin looked at her, and she looked at the robin. The old gardener pushed his cap back on his bald head and stared at her a minute. "Art thou the little wench from India?" he asked. Mary nodded. "There's no wonder thou'rt lonely. Thou'll be lonely before they're done," he said. He began to dig again, driving his pad deep into the rich black garden soil while the robin hopped about very busily employed. "What is your name?" Mary inquired. He stood up to answer her. "Ben Witherspoon," he answered, and then he added with a surly chuckle, "I'm lonely myself except when he's with me." And he jerked his thumb toward the robin. "He's thy only friend I got." "I have no friends at all," said Mary. "I never had. My ayah didn't like me, and I never played with anyone." It's a Yorkshire habit to say what you think with blunt frankness, and old Ben Witherspoon was a Yorkshire moor man. "Thou and me are good belike," he said. "We were out of the same clothes. We neither of us good looking, and we both of us as sore as we look. We got the same nasty tempers, both of us, I'll warrant." This was plain speaking, and Mary Langs had never heard the truth about herself in her life. Native servants always salaamed and submitted to her, whatever you did. She had never thought much about her looks, but she wondered if she was as unattractive as Ben Witherspoon, and she also wondered if she looked as sore as he had looked before the robin came. She actually began to wonder also if she was nasty-tempered. She felt uncomfortable. Suddenly a clear, rippling little sound broke out near her, and she turned around. She was standing a few feet from a young apple tree, and the robin had flown one on its branches and had burst into a scrap of a song. Ben Witherspoon laughed outright. "What did he do for that?" asked Mary. "He's made up his mind to make friends with thee," replied Ben. "Dang me if he hasn't took a fancy to thee." "To me?" said Mary, and she moved toward the little tree softly and looked up. "Would you make friends with me?" she said to the robin, just as if she was speaking to a person. "Would you?" And she did not say it either in her hard little voice or in her imperious Indian voice, but in a tone so soft and eager and coaxing that Ben Witherspoon was as surprised as she had been when she heard him whistle. "Why," he cried out, "thou art as nice and human as if thou a real child instead of sharp old woman. Thou said it almost like Dickon talks to his wild things on the moor." "Do you know Dickon?" Mary asked, turning round rather in a hurry. "Everybody knows him. Dickon's wandering about everywhere. The very blackberries and hazelbells knows him. I warrant the foxes shows him where their cubs lies on the skylarks doesn't hide their nests for him." Mary would have liked to ask some more questions. She was almost as curious about Dickon as she was about the deserted garden. But just at that moment the robin, who had ended his song, gave a little shake of his wings and spread them and flew away. He had made his visit and had other things to do. "He has flown over the wall," Mary cried out, watching him. "He has flown into the orchard. He has flown across the other wall into the garden where there's no door." "He lives there," said old Ben. "He came out of the egg there. If he's courting, he's making up to some young madam of a robin that lives among the old rose trees there." "Rose trees," said Mary. "Are there rose trees?" Ben Whistlesore took up his spade again and began to dig. "That was 10 years ago," he mumbled. "I should like to see them," said Mary. "Where's the green door? There must be a door somewhere." Ben drove his spade deep and looked as uncompanionable as he had looked when she first saw him. "That was 10 years ago, but there isn't now," he said. "No door?" cried Mary. "There must be." "None as anyone can find, and none as is anyone's business. Don't you be a meddlesome wench and poke your nose where it's no cause to go. Here I must go on with my work. Get your gun and play you. I've no more time." And he actually stopped digging, threw his spade over his shoulder, and walked off, without even glancing at her or saying goodbye.